The early morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as Mrs. Dorothy Washington carefully stepped out of her modest single-story home. At 78 years old, she moved with the deliberate grace that came from a lifetime of teaching young children to be mindful of their actions. Her silver hair was neatly wrapped in a bun, and she wore her favorite purple dress, the one her late husband James had given her on their 40th wedding anniversary, just 2 years before he passed. The morning air felt crisp against her face as she began her weekly walk to Carter's Market, just 3 blocks away from her home. Dorothy had lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years, watching it change and grow around her. She remembered when Carter's was just a small corner store, before Mr. Carter Sr. expanded it into the full-service supermarket it was today. As she walked, Dorothy noticed the usual signs of the neighborhood waking up. Mrs. Rodriguez was watering her prized roses, and they exchanged warm waves. The Lopez children, waiting for their school bus, called out "Good morning, Mrs. Washington," just as their parents had done when they were students in her third-grade class decades ago. These small interactions brought a gentle smile to her face, reminding her that even though she had retired from teaching 15 years ago, she was still very much a part of this community's fabric. Dorothy had always been organized in her routines. Tuesday was grocery shopping day. It had been for the past 32 years. She chose Tuesdays because the store was less crowded, and they restocked their fresh vegetables first thing in the morning. Her shopping list was written in neat handwriting on the back of an envelope, just as she had taught her students to reuse paper to help the environment. Pushing open the heavy glass door of Carter's Market, Dorothy felt the familiar rush of cool air conditioning. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery section filled the air. Young Tommy, one of the baggers who always helped her with her groceries, looked up from arranging shopping carts and gave her a bright smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Washington. Got your favorite cart ready for you, the one with the smooth wheels," Tommy said, pulling out a shopping cart he had specifically set aside. It was these little kindnesses that made Carter's feel like a second home to Dorothy. She began her usual route through the store, starting with the produce section. Dorothy had a system. She always checked the firmness of the tomatoes first, then moved on to the leafy greens. She was planning to make her famous collard greens for the church potluck that weekend. As she carefully selected the best leaves, she chatted with Maria, produce manager, about her grandchildren. "How did little Marcus do on his history test?" Dorothy asked, remembering their conversation from last week. Maria's face lit up as she shared the good news about her grandson's A grade, and Dorothy beamed with pride as if Marcus were her own grandchild. Moving through the aisles, Dorothy greeted other regular Tuesday morning shoppers. There was Mr. Chen, picking up special ingredients for his restaurant down the street. Mrs. Patterson, who had moved to the neighborhood just last year, stopped to ask Dorothy's advice about cooking sweet potato pie. Even young Sarah, a medical student who usually rushed through her shopping, always made time to stop and chat with Dorothy about her studies. As she reached for a can of beans on the middle shelf, Dorothy felt a slight twinge in her back. Without hesitation, store manager David Henderson, who had been arranging a display nearby, stepped over to help. "Let me get that for you, Mrs. Washington," he said warmly. "And don't forget we've got your favorite peach preserves on sale today. I set aside a jar for you." Dorothy's shopping basket slowly filled with her carefully selected items. Each product had its purpose: ingredients for her weekly meals, treats for the neighborhood children who still stopped by her house after school, and supplies for the care packages she regularly prepared for elderly neighbors who couldn't make it to the store themselves. The morning light streamed through the store's front windows, creating patterns on the polished floor. Dorothy felt at peace in this familiar routine, surrounded by friendly faces and warm greetings. Little did she know that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but routine. Dorothy was examining a bunch of ripe bananas when she first noticed the change in atmosphere at Carter's Market. The usual gentle music playing over the store speakers seemed to fade away as heavy footsteps echoed through the produce section. 2 police officers, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights, walked directly toward her with stern expressions on their faces. Officer Jensen was tall and rigid, his hand resting casually on his belt. Officer Murphy was shorter but broader, and he carried a clipboard that seemed out of place. Neither of them smiled as they approached Dorothy, who continued to carefully select her fruit, thinking they must be heading somewhere else in the store. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the produce," Officer Jensen said sharply, causing Dorothy to jump slightly. Several other shoppers stopped their carts, watching the scene unfold. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she placed the bananas back on the display. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She straightened her purple dress, a habit from her teaching days when she wanted to appear composed in challenging situations. "We received a report of suspicious behavior in this area," Officer Murphy stated, flipping through his clipboard. "Someone matching your description has been observed handling multiple items without purchasing them." Dorothy's chest tightened as she realized what was happening. She had been carefully selecting her produce, just as she had done every Tuesday for over 3 decades. The absurdity of the situation might have made her laugh if it hadn't been so frightening. Store manager David Henderson, who had been helping another customer, noticed the commotion and quickly made his way over. "Officers, there must be some mistake," he said, stepping between them and Dorothy. "Mrs. Washington is one of our most valued customers. She's been shopping here every Tuesday for longer than I've been manager." Officer Jensen held up his hand dismissively. "Sir, please step back. This is a police matter." His voice carried through the store, drawing more attention. Young Tommy, the bagger, watched with wide eyes from behind a stack of shopping baskets, his hands gripping the plastic tightly. "I'm just doing my shopping," Dorothy explained calmly, though her voice quivered slightly. She reached into her purse to show them her shopping list, but Officer Murphy's hand instantly moved to his weapon. "Keep your hands where we can see them," he ordered sharply, causing nearby shoppers to gasp. Dorothy slowly raised her hands, her dignity intact even as tears threatened to form in her eyes. Maria, the produce manager, stepped forward. "I've been helping Mrs. Washington pick out her collard greens for the church potluck," she said firmly. "She's doing nothing wrong." More customers began to gather at the ends of nearby aisles. Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone and started recording. Mr. Chen stepped closer, abandoning his shopping cart. The officers seemed to grow more aggressive in response to the gathering crowd. "Everyone needs to mind their own business and step back," Officer Jensen announced loudly. "This is an official investigation." Dorothy stood perfectly still, her mind racing back to similar situations she had faced in her youth, situations she had hoped were long behind her. But something was different this time. She could feel it in the energy of the store, in the way her fellow shoppers were responding. Sarah, the medical student, pushed through the growing crowd. Her hospital ID badge still hung around her neck as she positioned herself next to Dorothy. "I'm staying right here," she said quietly but firmly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as tension filled the air. Dorothy's carefully selected groceries sat abandoned in her cart nearby. The morning that had started so normally had transformed into something that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone watching. Officer Murphy began speaking into his radio, requesting backup, while Officer Jensen continued to demand that people step back. But the crowd of shoppers only grew larger, their phones recording, their faces showing a mix of concern and determination. This wasn't just about Dorothy anymore. It was about something much bigger, and everyone in Carter's Market knew it. The next few minutes in Carter's Market unfolded like a scene from a movie, but this was real life, and the consequences would echo far beyond the store's walls. As news of the confrontation spread through the aisles, more shoppers left their carts and gathered near the produce section. The sound of phone cameras clicking filled the air. James Miller, owner of the hardware store down the street, had only stopped in for a quick purchase. Now he stood firmly in the growing circle of people around Dorothy. He knew her well. She had taught both his children, and they still talked about how she had helped them love reading. "This is completely unacceptable," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Maria Rodriguez, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from her night shift at Memorial Hospital, stepped closer to Dorothy. She had treated countless victims of stress-induced health problems and could see the tension in Dorothy's shoulders. "Mrs. Washington, please sit down," she said gently, pulling up a chair from the nearby customer service desk. "Your blood pressure, remember?" The officers looked increasingly uncomfortable as more phones recorded their every move. Officer Jensen's face had turned red, and Officer Murphy kept adjusting his clipboard, almost hiding behind it. The backup they had called for was still minutes away. A young teenager, Kevin Williams, who usually helped Dorothy carry her groceries to her car after school, pushed through the crowd. "Mrs. Washington gives me cookies every Tuesday," he announced defiantly. "She's the nicest person in the whole neighborhood." His mother tried to pull him back, but his words had already added to the powerful moment. Sarah Chen, the medical student who had first stepped forward, was now live streaming the incident on her phone. "I want everyone to see how our community protects its own," she said clearly into her phone's camera. "Mrs. Washington has lived here for 50 years. She volunteers at the hospital, she helps everyone, and this is how she's treated while buying groceries." The store manager, David Henderson, had been on the phone with the store's owner, Mr. Carter Jr. Now he returned with determination in his eyes. "Mr. Carter says if anyone should leave the store, it's not Mrs. Washington. She's been shopping here since his father owned this place." Dorothy sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, showing the same patience she had used with generations of students. But tears finally rolled down her cheeks, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming show of support around her. Mrs. Patterson, who had been recording everything, suddenly spoke up. "My mother faced similar treatment in the 1960s, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I never thought I'd see this happening in 2025. But I never thought I'd see this kind of unity either." The crowd had grown to include people from every background imaginable. Mr. Lee from the dry cleaners stood next to Ms. Thompson from the bank. The high school football coach had his arm around Dorothy's former student, now a city bus driver. They formed an unbreakable human chain of support. Through the store's front windows, people could see more police cars arriving in the parking lot, but something else was happening too. Local residents, seeing the gathering crowd inside, were parking their cars and walking in. The story was already spreading across social media, and people were coming to stand with Dorothy. "My grandson showed me how to do this," said elderly Mrs. Jenkins, fumbling with her phone's camera. "The whole world needs to see what happens when you mess with one of our own." The officers' radios crackled with questions from their superiors, wanting to know why a simple, suspicious person call had turned into a viral social media event. Neither officer could provide a good answer. Tommy, the young bagger, had been busy. He gathered all of Dorothy's carefully selected groceries that had been abandoned during the confrontation and was quietly repacking them in fresh bags. It was his way of showing support, making sure her original shopping mission would be completed, no matter what happened next. The morning sun now streamed fully through the store's windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight. What had started as an attempt to intimidate one elderly woman had transformed into a powerful demonstration of community strength, and this was only the beginning. A deep, commanding voice cut through the tension in Carter's Market. "What in God's name is going on here?" Reverend Michael Thompson stood in the entrance, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. He had just parked his church van outside, planning to pick up supplies for the food bank, when he saw the police cars and the crowd through the windows. The Reverend's presence changed the energy in the room immediately. He had been a civil rights activist in his younger days, and at 65, he still commanded respect throughout the community. As he walked toward the scene, people automatically made way for him. Officer Jensen straightened his back nervously. Many of the officers at the precinct attended Reverend Thompson's church, and his influence in the community was well known. "Sir, we're conducting an official investigation," he began, but the Reverend held up his hand. "An investigation of Dorothy Washington?" Reverend Thompson's voice carried clearly through the store. "The same Dorothy Washington who has volunteered at our food bank every Wednesday for the past 20 years. The woman who tutors our children for free and makes soup for sick neighbors." He moved to stand beside Dorothy's chair, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Reverend," Dorothy said softly, looking up at him with tears still visible on her cheeks. He squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before turning back to the officers. "Young man," he addressed Officer Jensen, "I was there when this store first allowed black customers to shop here. I was here when Mr. Carter Sr. hired the first black employees. And I'm here now, watching you harass a pillar of this community while she buys groceries for our church potluck." The backup officers who had just arrived stood uncertainly at the edge of the crowd, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong with the original call. One of them, Officer Robinson, recognized Dorothy from the reading program she ran at the community center where his kids attended. "Do you know what Mrs. Washington did last month?" Reverend Thompson continued, his voice growing stronger. "When Officer Martinez's mother was sick with cancer, She organized a meal train. She cooked dinner for their family twice a week. That's who you're treating like a criminal today. Sarah Chen's live stream had now reached over 10,000 viewers. Comments of support were pouring in from across the city. Local news vans had begun arriving in the parking lot, their crews rushing to set up equipment. Officer Murphy's clipboard slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor. When he bent to pick it up, everyone could see his hands shaking. The suspicious behavior report that had started all this lay face up on the floor. A single sheet of paper with barely any information on it. "I think," Reverend Thompson said firmly, "it's time for you to explain to your superiors why you chose to harass a respected elderly woman instead of building bridges with your community. Because that is your job, isn't it? To protect and serve." A new figure pushed through the crowd. Police Captain Williams, who had been alerted to the situation by concerned citizens watching the live stream. His face was grave as he took in the scene. "Officers Jensen and Murphy," he said sharply, "step outside. Now." His tone left no room for argument. As the two officers moved toward the exit, the crowd parted silently, their phones still recording every moment. Dorothy finally stood up from her chair, her dignity intact despite everything that had happened. "Reverend," she said clearly, "I still need to finish my shopping. Potluck is tomorrow, and those children are counting on my sweet potato pie." A ripple of laughter and applause spread through the crowd. Tommy, the young bagger, stepped forward with her carefully repacked groceries. "I made sure to pick the best sweet potatoes, Mrs. Washington," he said proudly. Captain Williams turned to Dorothy, removing his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Washington, on behalf of the department, I want to." But Dorothy gently interrupted him. "Young man," she said with the patience of a longtime teacher, "we have a lot to discuss about how your officers treat people in this community. But first, I need to finish my shopping. Would you like to help me pick out some pecans for my pie? While we walk, you can tell me about your plans to make sure this never happens to anyone else." By sunset that same day, Sarah Chen's livestream video had been viewed over 1 million times. But unlike many viral videos of confrontations with police, this one showed something different. It showed a community standing together, protecting one of their own with dignity and determination. Local news stations camped outside Carter's Market, their satellite trucks lining the street. Inside her modest home, Dorothy sat in her favorite armchair, overwhelmed by the constant ringing of her phone. Her granddaughter, Lisa, had flown in from Chicago after seeing the video on her office computer. "Grandma," Lisa said, scrolling through her phone, "you're trending on Twitter. People are calling you grocery store grandma and community queen. They're sharing stories about how you helped them in school or around the neighborhood." Dorothy shook her head slowly, still processing the day's events. Her kitchen counter was covered with flower bouquets and food deliveries from neighbors. Every few minutes, someone would knock on her door just to check if she was okay. The video clips spreading across social media showed different moments from the incident. One clip focused on young Tommy carefully repacking her groceries. Another showed Mr. Chen standing firm with his arms crossed. But the most popular clip was of Dorothy's final words to Captain Williams about picking out pecans while discussing police reform. "That's my teacher." Former students commented on the videos. "She helped me learn to read. Mrs. Washington gave me lunch money when my family was struggling." The comments section became a living history of Dorothy's 35 years of teaching and community service. Sarah Chen appeared on the evening news, her hospital ID badge still visible on her scrubs. "I started recording because I wanted evidence if things went wrong," she explained to the reporter. "But instead, I captured something beautiful. A whole community saying enough is enough and standing up for what's right." At the police station, Captain Williams called an emergency meeting. The department's social media accounts were flooded with messages. Other police departments across the country were calling to ask about the incident, worried about similar situations in their own communities. Reverend Thompson's phone hadn't stopped buzzing either. National civil rights organizations wanted him to speak about the community's response. But instead of giving interviews, he focused on organizing a community meeting for the next evening at his church. Back at Carter's Market, something unexpected was happening. People from across the city were showing up to shop, wanting to support the store that had stood by Dorothy. Mr. Carter Jr. decided to turn the attention into something positive. He set up a donation box for the food bank where Dorothy volunteered, and within hours, it was overflowing. The local high school principal, Dr. Roberts, used the video in his morning assembly. "This is what community means," he told his students. When Mrs. Washington taught here, she always said that education isn't just about books. It's about standing up for what's right. By evening, a new hashtag was trending. Hashtag Stand Like Washington. People shared stories of times when their communities came together to fight injustice. Dorothy's story had touched something deep in people's hearts. The desire to believe that when things go wrong, your neighbors will stand with you. Maria Rodriguez, the nurse who had worried about Dorothy's blood pressure, started a new Facebook group, Community Guardians. Its purpose was simple: to organize people who could accompany elderly shoppers on their errands, ensuring they felt safe and supported. The most powerful moment, Tommy told a local reporter while bagging groceries, wasn't when the police left. It was when Mrs. Washington insisted on finishing her shopping. She showed them that she belonged here, that this was her community, and nothing they did could take that away from her. As the sun set on that extraordinary Tuesday, Dorothy sat in her living room surrounded by family and neighbors, sipping tea from her favorite cup. The sweet potato pie she'd finally managed to bake sat cooling on the counter. Outside, a group of her former students had organized an impromptu candlelight vigil of support. The story wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a symbol of hope, showing what could happen when a community refused to let fear and prejudice win. And this was just the beginning of the changes to come. The next morning, Police Chief Robert Martinez stood before a crowd of reporters outside the police department. The morning sun made the badges of the officers standing behind him glint brightly. His hands gripped the podium tightly as camera flashes went off like lightning. "What happened to Mrs. Dorothy Washington yesterday is unacceptable," he began, his voice firm and clear. "Officers Jensen and Murphy have been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. But that's just the beginning of our response." Inside her home, Dorothy watched the press conference on her small television, surrounded by her family. Her daughter Rachel held her hand tightly as the police chief continued to speak. The chief's words were different from the usual official responses to such incidents. There was no defending the officers' actions, no talk of following procedures. "I've spoken with Mrs. Washington personally," Chief Martinez announced, surprising even the reporters. The cameras caught him wiping away a tear. "This morning, I visited her home. I sat at her kitchen table, and she served me the same sweet potato pie she was trying to buy ingredients for when this incident occurred." The reporters leaned forward, sensing this wasn't going to be a typical press conference. Chief Martinez pulled out a piece of paper. It was Dorothy's original shopping list from the day before, still neat despite everything that had happened. "This shopping list," he held it up for the cameras, "represents everything that's wrong with what happened. An elderly woman, buying ingredients to make food for a church potluck, was treated like a criminal. But it also represents everything that's about to change in our department." At the precinct, officers gathered around televisions, watching their chief with mixed emotions. Some looked uncomfortable, others nodded in agreement. Officer Robinson, who had arrived as backup the day before, stood with his arms crossed, remembering how his own children benefited from Dorothy's reading program. Effective immediately, Chief Martinez continued, "We are implementing Project Washington, a complete overhaul of our community policing program. Every officer will undergo new training, but not just in a classroom. They'll spend time volunteering at community centers, attending neighborhood meetings, and yes, even shopping at local stores alongside the citizens they're sworn to protect." Dorothy's phone rang. It was Reverend Thompson. "Are you watching this?" he asked excitedly. "This is what real change looks like, Dorothy. Your dignity opened the door for something bigger than any of us imagined." Back at the press conference, Chief Martinez wasn't finished. "We're establishing a civilian oversight committee, and I've asked Mrs. Washington to be its first chairperson. She spent her life teaching children. Now she'll help teach our department how to better serve its community." The reporters erupted with questions, but the chief raised his hand for silence. "There's more. Officers Jensen and Murphy have requested a private meeting with Mrs. Washington to apologize in person. She has graciously agreed, on one condition: that they join her next week at the food bank where she volunteers. She wants them to see firsthand what community really means." In her living room, Dorothy dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Her grandson Marcus, who had driven in from Atlanta after seeing the video, hugged her shoulders. "Grandma, you're changing things without even trying," he whispered. The police department's social media team posted the full video of the chief's speech. Within hours, police departments from other cities began calling, asking about Project Washington and how they could implement similar programs. "This isn't just about policy changes," Chief Martinez concluded, his voice growing stronger. "This is about transforming how we think about policing." Mrs. Washington spent her career teaching children to be better people. Now, she's teaching our entire department the same lesson. As the press conference ended, the cameras caught something unexpected. Several officers in the background were wiping away tears. One of them was a rookie who had just graduated from the academy. She had been one of Dorothy's last students before retirement. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as the reporters packed up their equipment. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in how a community and its police force could work together for real change. 1 month after the incident, Carter's Market looked very different on Tuesday mornings. What used to be their quietest shopping day had transformed into something special. Senior citizens from all over the city came to do their shopping, each accompanied by volunteer shopping buddies from the Community Guardians program that Maria Rodriguez had started. Dorothy stood near the entrance, wearing a bright yellow vest with Community Guardian Coordinator written on the back. Her clipboard held a list of paired shoppers and volunteers. Young and old, people of all backgrounds signed up to help. Even some police officers joined in during their off-duty hours. Mrs. Washington called out Officer Jensen, who now volunteered every Tuesday morning. The incident had changed him deeply. After spending time at the food bank with Dorothy, he had become one of the most active supporters of Project Washington. Today, he was helping Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who barely spoke English, find ingredients for her grandson's birthday cake. Sarah Chen, whose live stream had started it all, had created a free health clinic in the store's community room. Every Tuesday morning, she and other medical students from her hospital provided basic health checks for elderly shoppers. "Prevention is better than cure," she would say, just as Dorothy had taught her in 3rd grade. The store itself had changed too. Mr. Carter Jr. had installed more benches throughout the aisles, added better lighting, and created a community bulletin board near the entrance. The board was covered with photos of shopping buddies with their senior partners, announcements for community events, and at the center, the original newspaper article about Dorothy's incident. "Look at this," Tommy said proudly, showing Dorothy the store's new training manual. He had been promoted to assistant manager after Mr. Carter Jr. saw his actions during the incident. The manual now included a section called the Washington Protocol, guidelines for treating every customer with dignity and respect. Outside in the parking lot, Reverend Thompson's church had set up a free shuttle service for elderly shoppers who couldn't drive. The white van with Community Unity painted on its side made regular rounds through the neighborhood. The service was funded by donations that had poured in after the incident went viral. Dorothy watched as Officer Murphy, who had also been transformed by the experience, helped an elderly man load groceries into the shuttle. The same hands that had reached for a weapon that day now gently steadied an old man's elbow as he climbed the van's steps. Inside the store, the produce section where everything had started now featured a small garden. Local school children tended the herbs and vegetables as part of their science classes. The food bank received fresh produce every week, and Dorothy used the garden to teach children about growing their own food. Mrs. Washington called out a teenage girl. It was Kevin's sister, Lisa, who had started a youth volunteer program after seeing her brother stand up for Dorothy that day. "Can you help us plan next week's senior dance? We're having it in the community room after shopping hours." The community room, once just a storage space, had become the heart of the neighborhood. Senior dance classes, ESL lessons, police community meetings, and youth programs filled its weekly calendar. The room's wall featured a large mural painted by local artists, showing diverse hands joined in a circle around the words, "Stand like Washington." Maria Rodriguez's Community Guardians program had spread to other stores across the city. Other communities requested training on how to set up similar programs. Dorothy found herself giving speeches at community centers, sharing how a terrible moment had transformed into a movement for change. Even the local police academy had changed its training program. New recruits now spent time volunteering in the community before getting their badges. Dorothy was a regular speaker at their training sessions, sharing her story and teaching them about the power of dignity and respect. As she looked around the bustling store, Dorothy saw Officer Jensen helping Mrs. Chen pick out cake decorations, Sarah checking an elderly man's blood pressure, and Tommy training a new employee in the Washington Protocol. Tears of joy filled her eyes as she remembered how far they had come from that terrible Tuesday morning. A young mother approached Dorothy, pushing a stroller. "My grandmother is moving to the neighborhood next month," she said. "I heard this is the safest place for elderly people to shop. Is that true?" Dorothy smiled, looking at the diverse group of people working together to make their communities stronger. "It's more than safe," she replied. "It's home." 6 months after the incident at Carter's Market, Dorothy Washington sat in the front row of City Hall's main chamber. The room was packed with people who had come to witness a historic moment. Mayor Richardson stood at the podium, holding up a document that would change the city's future. "Today, we signed the Dorothy Washington Community Protection Act," the mayor announced, her voice clear and strong. "This law ensures that what happened 6 months ago will never happen again in our city." Dorothy, dressed in her favorite purple dress, the same one she had worn that fateful day, watched as city council members stepped forward to sign the document. The act required all police officers to undergo community integration training, established civilian oversight committees in every district, and provided funding for community support programs. In the audience sat Officers Jensen and Murphy, now working as trainers for Project Washington. The program they had helped create had already trained over 300 officers from departments across the country. Their story of transformation had become a powerful example of how people could change when given the chance to learn from their mistakes. "Mrs. Washington," Officer Jensen had told her earlier that morning, "you didn't just teach us about policing. You taught us about forgiveness and growth." His eyes had filled with tears as he spoke, remembering how far they had come from that terrible Tuesday morning. Sarah Chen, now chief resident at her hospital, sat next to Dorothy. Her medical outreach program had grown into a citywide initiative, with free health clinics operating in grocery stores across the city. The program had already helped identify and treat hundreds of elderly patients who might otherwise have gone without care. Tommy, who had become the youngest store manager in Carter's Market history, was there too. He had just finished presenting the Washington Protocol to a national retail association, and stores across the country were adopting similar training programs. "The real victory," Dorothy told a reporter after the ceremony, "isn't in the law that bears my name. It's in the way our community discovered its own strength. We learned that when we stand together, we can create the change we want to see." The Community Guardians program had spread to 50 cities, with Maria Rodriguez traveling around the country to help set up new chapters. The simple idea of neighbors helping neighbors had grown into a national movement. Back at Carter's Market, the community room wall now displayed a timeline of everything that had happened since that day. Photos showed the candlelight vigil, the first senior dance, Officer Jensen volunteering at the food bank, and countless moments of community unity. Dorothy's grandson Marcus had created a documentary about the incident and its aftermath. It wasn't just about what had gone wrong that day. It was about how a community had come together to make things right. The film had won awards and was being shown in police academies and community centers nationwide. Reverend Thompson's church had become a training center for community organizers. People came from all over to learn how to build bridges between police and communities, using the Washington model of peaceful transformation through unity and dignity. As Dorothy left City Hall that afternoon, she passed a group of school children on a field trip. Their teacher was explaining how one person's dignity and a community's unity had changed their city. The children waved at Dorothy, recognizing her from the photos in their history books. "My grandma says you're a hero," one little girl called out. Dorothy smiled gently. "The real heroes," she replied, "are all the people who stood up that day, and every day since, to make our community better. Sometimes it just takes one person to start the change, but it takes everyone to make it last." Later that evening, Dorothy sat in her favorite chair at home, looking through a scrapbook of memories from the past 6 months. There was the original shopping list that had started it all, now framed and hanging in the police academy. There were photos of community events, newspaper clippings, and letters from people whose lives had been touched by the changes that followed. As the sun set outside her window, Dorothy thought about all the Tuesday mornings yet to come. Thanks to what had happened that day, they would be filled with friendship, dignity, and the warmth of a community that had learned to stand together. Her simple shopping trip had become a lesson that would be taught for generations to come, a lesson about courage, unity, and the power of standing up for what's right with dignity and grace.